Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. This time around, we're taking a trip to the ruggedly beautiful yet geopolitically thorny region known as the South Caucasus. We're talking Azerbaijan, Russia, and the latest tragic case of things that should never fall from the sky. We want to set the record straight on the Moscow-Baku relations, especially as they stand today in the wake of the tragic airplane crash in Kazakhstan. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Relations between Russia and Azerbaijan are deteriorating. Baku has announced that in the coming days it will introduce stricter residency regulations for Russian citizens. The move comes in response to recent changes in Russia's immigration policy, which have particularly affected Azerbaijani nationals. Starting 2025, foreign citizens entering Russia without a visa will be allowed to stay for a maximum of 90 days within a year, a reduction from the previous 90 days every 6 months. The tightening of migration laws in Russia began after a deadly terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall near Moscow, in which 145 people were killed and over 550 were wounded. The attackers were suspected to be citizens of Tajikistan, which led to growing anti-immigrant sentiments across the country. But despite this growing rift, Azerbaijan is still seeking BRICS membership. And no wonder, the increasing significance of the South Caucasus and Azerbaijan's potential membership in the bloc would allow it to maintain ties with Russia and China while simultaneously building relations with the West.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. First, let's rewind to the 9th of November 2020, a date that shall live in infamy and also probably in history textbooks. Azerbaijani forces had just captured the city of Shusha during the Second Karabakh War. They were this close to entering the capital, Khankendi, only 10 kilometers away. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a Russian helicopter near the Nakhchivan-Armenia border was shot down. According to Azerbaijan's perspective, the helicopter was flying dangerously close, less than a kilometer from the border without proper identification. Russia immediately threw down the diplomatic gauntlet, demanding an acknowledgment, an apology, compensation, and that Azerbaijan should freeze any further military action in the area. Baku said, "We're sorry, here is some compensation," and halted its military advances. No one loves a good moral of the story, but the moral here seems to be, if a big neighbor demands something, you might just say yes. Now fast forward to the present day, and we've got a new fiasco in the skies. This time, it's not a military helicopter, but an Azerbaijan Airlines civilian airplane that crashed near Aktau, Kazakhstan. The flight was headed through Russian airspace, apparently a dicey proposition these days, when everything went tragically wrong. The difference here? Civilian casualties, major airline involvement, and the oh-so-charming possibility that electronic warfare was used against the aircraft in question. In fact, it was used against Ukrainian drones in the area, but it also messed with the plane's GPS signals. Because if there is one thing the 21st century has taught us, it's that everything can be blamed on drones at least once a month. Now, Azerbaijan's position on this disaster is crystal clear. They want an acknowledgement of the incident, an apology, and compensation. If that formula rings a bell, it's because it's exactly what Russia demanded of Azerbaijan back in 2020. So, in a cosmic twist of irony, the roles have been reversed. Back in 2020, Azerbaijan apologized immediately, and that helped simmer down tensions. This time, Russia has gone with a different approach. Partial acknowledgement, zero apology, no compensation. If this were a relationship, would be telling Azerbaijan to stay away from that toxic partner. President Vladimir Putin did call Ilham Aliyev. Sure, he offered regret that it happened in Russian airspace, but that's not exactly the hallmark "I'm sorry" card you would hope for. It's more like, "Sorry you feel that way," which is basically the same as not apologizing at all. So, will we see a big, teary-eyed apology from Putin? Don't hold your breath. But we might see a quiet recalibration in Moscow's approach, if only to keep other regional players from following Azerbaijan's lead. And now, here to shed more light on this story is Rusif Husseinov, director of the Top-Chebyshev Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me back on the show.
So, there were two conversations between Ilham Aliyev and Vladimir Putin. From what we know, it was not even entirely an apology, not to mention there was nothing said about compensation there. Can you shed more light on how this interaction went? Because it's also very interesting on how President Aliyev initially responded to the reports concerning how Russia was trying to explain the tragedy.
Yes, you are right. It was kind of an apology, which was not an apology per se. But before going into the two conversations between the leaders, Aliyev and Putin, let me tell you that if we analyze this long and infamous list of downing civilian aircraft by the Russians/Soviets in the past, if you remember, none of these tragic incidents was ever followed by any apology or acknowledgement by the Russians. But here, maybe for the first time in their history, in our history, the Russians actually sort of apologized, but during the very first telephone conversation, Putin stopped short of admitting the guilt of the Russian side, and this was not sufficient for the Azerbaijani leadership, and this is why Ilham Aliyev, after the first conversation, went on the national television and denounced the Russia's actions in a very harsh, severe language. What was the essence of the second telephone conversation? We can guess because there is really limited knowledge about the topics of the conversation. But I guess right now it's especially important for the Russian side to save their face and also find some sort of an exit strategy out of this situation.
So let's talk about the language values used, because that was really interesting. You've already mentioned these were some strong statements, including that Russia's explanation of the incident, the initial one, was, and I quote, delusional. That, of course, was in reference to the bird flock theory and the oxygen tank exploding theory. But also, Ilham Aliyev did not hide the fact that he was disappointed. It's a fairly emotional language, right? In many cases, you just try to make it sound like, you're a head of state. You're not really saying things which would reveal how you feel about things. But in this case, he sounded bitter. He sounded even quite enraged by what he heard from the Russians. Disappointed, of course, because he said, well, we have friendly relations. Why are you acting that way? Would you say that it was rather unusual?
Exactly. Because you would never hear two anti-Russian position or statements from the Azerbaijani side, which is usually very, very careful in its policies towards the Kremlin. However, this was really a tragic incident, and Ilham Aliyev, when he heard about this incident, he was on his way to St. Petersburg to participate in the CIS summit. He simply made a U-turn without even arriving in the destination, came back to Baku, and that was his very first démarche. And we can guess that he could have already learned more details about this airplane flight crash. But the Azerbaijani side gave at least 2 or 3 days for the Russians in order to, emerge with some sort of acknowledgement and apology. And when it did not come out, and instead the Russians tried to circulate so many interesting and absurd versions that it was really too much for the Azerbaijani side. And there was some leaks to the international media outlets from the Azerbaijani officials that pointed out to the Russians. And right now, and we also know that the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, who was, in our understanding, partially or fully responsible for this whole incident, also offered some sort of help or humanitarian aid or some sort of compensation to the Azerbaijani side, but it was rejected by Baku, who now expects the official acknowledgement and apology from the highest level in the Kremlin.
So now the big question is what's going to happen next, okay? Because we do know that there is at least a marriage of convenience at stake. Azerbaijan is not as much of a traditional ally of Russia as some other countries in the region, but they had good relations. Are these relations likely to deteriorate? Can you perhaps look at these relations on a timeline, in a way, looking back at the Nagorno-Karabakh war, for example, at least, the final episodes of the said war, and the fact that Armenia, for example, was counting on Russian support in that conflict. Azerbaijan won, Armenia came out disillusioned, turned towards the West. Now, what impact did it have on the relations between Moscow and Baku? And are these relations likely to experience another shift right now?
While many experts refer to the Azerbaijani foreign policy as balancing, I like to call it equidistance, or an equal distance from both the Western Bloc and Russian/Eurasian structures, which means the Azerbaijani side wants to maintain more or less friendly relations by all the geopolitical poles without actually aligning with any of them. This is the case with Russia as well. Of course, we want to keep these friendly terms, but also maintain our distance from Moscow. I would not believe that this incident would seriously deteriorate the Azerbaijani-Russian relations just because no matter whether the Russians accept, assume the responsibility and pay compensation or not, the Azerbaijani political leadership has already won this standoff by their position, by gaining the international sympathy, by reacting so harshly to the Kremlin. Also, as you rightly mentioned, we won the Second Karabakh War in 2020 by beating a Russia ally, which is Armenia, and Russian weapons in Karabakh. And this year, there was another huge accomplishment, which actually went largely unnoticed by international media outlets. We managed to kick the Russian peacekeepers out of Karabakh. So there is no Russian or international at all military presence on the Azerbaijani soil, which means Azerbaijan has flexibility in its foreign policy priorities.
So there were suggestions that these relations could potentially deteriorate if Moscow makes some inadequate moves. For example, if it continues to ignore the calls for compensation. Other commentators said this is going to be done quietly, i.e. Russia will wait for a while for the matter to quiet down a bit. Later on, they might pay compensation, but not officially. Also, they might apologize again during some sort of meeting with no journalists anywhere, to witness that. Which way is it more likely to go? Do you think pragmatism is going to take precedence over perhaps the desire to maintain this, strong position, a position of dignity vis-a-vis Moscow?
Any of the options you just raised could happen. I don't exclude any of them. But as I said earlier, in my case, in my understanding, the Azerbaijan has already won the case by publicizing this whole incident, because the Russians wanted actually to keep a low profile about this whole thing, and also showing their teeth against the Kremlin. And we know how the leadership in Moscow, they are so annoyed or irritated by, when some of the post-Soviet countries actually go against them. But here, the expert community in Azerbaijan, we usually believe that right now, under the current circumstances, especially since the invasion of Ukraine broke out, Russia needs Azerbaijan more than Azerbaijan needs Russia. Therefore, they actually have to play with us. And it's actually not only about Azerbaijan, also partially about Turkey, because Azerbaijan and Turkey, they usually play in tandem when it comes to the regional geopolitics. And right now, the Azerbaijani foreign ministry also sent a delegation to Syria after Turkey has also triumphed there. So it's not only about Azerbaijan, it's about Azerbaijani-Turkish tandem, it's about regional geopolitics.
So would you say that it is really, the case of yet another instance in which Russian position has eroded? I'm glad that you mentioned Syria, because this, even though the Russian propaganda is just trying to say, it doesn't really matter, we don't really care, but they do, right? They were trying to build a presence there for years. Right now, it is pretty much gone. So is this just another instance where the Russian influence in yet another region is simply slowly but surely beginning to disappear?
Absolutely. You are right. The military presence they had built in Syria over the years is gone in a few days. And of course, their presence in Syria is diminishing. And it's not only about Syria now, because by diminishing or losing their presence in Syria, their logistics to Africa will also be harmed, and we'll see probably less and less Russian presence in Africa. Right now we see how much they're losing their reputation in wider Eurasia as well. Many countries, Central Asian or Armenia or Moldova, they are also trying to reduce the Russian influence on their soil. So right now, the Kremlin's position in many regions where they are traditionally influential is diminishing a lot.
So these are the geopolitical consequences. One, of course, has to acknowledge that, regrettably, what started these changes was an immense human tragedy. And also, as we finish this episode, acknowledgement to the heroism of the pilots, of the crew of the flight, who have managed to do something almost impossible, leading the flight to Kazakhstan, saving 29 lives. An immense achievement. Rusif Husseinov was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The Ukrainian foreign minister made a surprise visit to Damascus, where he called on Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, to expel Russian forces from the country. His comments come as Russia's influence in Syria faces challenges after the removal of Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad earlier this month.
Russia, a long-time ally of Assad, has had a significant military presence in Syria since its intervention in the civil war in 2015, which helped Assad regain control of much of the country. However, with the ongoing war in Ukraine and Assad's ousting, Moscow is now focused on securing its strategic military assets in Syria. Kyiv seems to be interested in exploiting this opportunity. While in Syria, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha criticized the relationship between Russia and the Assad regime, describing both as regimes based on violence and torture. He emphasized that the removal of Russian forces from Syria would contribute to the stability of not just Syria, but the broader Middle East and Africa. Sybiha also indicated that Ukraine is open to rebuilding diplomatic ties with the country. In a show of support for Syria, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukraine had sent its first shipment of humanitarian aid to the war-torn country. The shipment, consisting of 500 tons of wheat flour, is expected to arrive in Syria soon.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has strongly opposed the idea of deploying Western peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, following suggestions from European leaders and US President-elect Donald Trump. This comes as efforts to negotiate a peace deal remain stalled, with Moscow and Kyiv still clashing over territorial concessions and NATO membership.
In an interview with Russia's state-run TASS news agency, Lavrov rejected the concept of foreign troops enforcing a peace deal, following suggestions of deploying a peacekeeping force to Ukraine from French President Emmanuel Macron and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He also expressed dissatisfaction with proposals put forward by US President-elect Donald Trump, who vowed to end the conflict upon taking office. While Trump has not yet presented a concrete plan, members of his team have floated ideas such as the deployment of European troops to monetary ceasefire along the 1,000-kilometer front line and a significant delay on Ukraine's NATO membership. However, both the Russian and Ukrainian presidents have ruled out direct negotiations, with stark differences in their positions. Vladimir Putin has demanded that Ukraine withdraw its troops from the 4 eastern and southern regions that Russia claims to have annexed. In contrast, Kiev has steadfastly rejected ceding any territory to Moscow in exchange for peace.
Germany's Federal Prosecutor's Office has charged 3 German Russian citizens with espionage on behalf of Russia, accusing them of plotting to sabotage critical infrastructure in the country. The suspects, alleged to have taken photographs of military facilities, have reportedly planned attacks on railway lines.
Warnings about Russian hybrid attacks and sabotage operations against NATO countries have been mounting since Moscow launched its full-scale war against Ukraine. In the most recent case, German authorities charged 3 individuals with espionage and sabotage. German authorities revealed that the main suspect, Dieter S., has ties to Russian intelligence services and previously fought for Russian-backed forces in Ukraine's Donbas region between 2014 and 2016. He had already been charged in October for his role in the conflict, including fighting at the Donetsk International Airport. The other 2 suspects are believed to have explored potential targets in Bavaria, including the US military base in Grafenwörth, where Ukrainian troops are being trained. In addition to plans for sabotaging railway tracks, the group reportedly discussed bombings and arson attacks designed to undermine Germany's support for Ukraine.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.